Welcome to our How to Create a Lesson Plan workshop. I'm Kristen Brogy. Before we start talking about lesson plans, I do actually just want to be sure that we're all clear on exactly what a lesson plan is. But what I'm going to start with is, before we really jump in, what is it that you think instructors should consider in order to plan a successful lesson? And there's no right or wrong answer. Just imagine that you were tasked with the job of creating a lesson or creating a workshop. What are some of the things, what would you do next? What are some of the things you would think about? What are things you would need to know or to do to plan a successful lesson? Any thoughts?
So consider the what the expectations of the students are when you're planning something, so that you are meeting their expectations, and understanding the levels of different levels of the students that are in your class.
Yeah, so what are they expecting? Where are they coming from? Absolutely. And as I said, no right or wrong answer. Oh, and I'm showing us the same slide again. Sorry about that. So this is what we were just talking about. And the reason why I started our lesson that way is I did an open activity called a Do Now. A Do Now is a really good way to start a lesson because it starts to collect background information from attendees. So Lori, just like you were saying, if I am going to be running a lesson, even if I can't get that background information beforehand, I at least, when I start my lesson, can start to see what it is that my students, my attendees know. So starting a workshop, a class, a lesson, whatever it is that you're working on, with some level of engagement, some sort of engaging exercise, it gets your participants really thinking about the topic that's going to be presented. It also helps you as the instructor get some background, gauge what your students already know, understand what it is that they expect out of the lesson. So, and Do Nows at the beginning of a lesson really can be anything that starts getting people engaged. So now that I have a bit of an idea of what you're thinking about, I'm going to go over why we're all here today. Our big picture for this workshop is to know what to include in a basic lesson plan, how to create a plan to help guide a lesson by really planning out what it is that you're going to teach, how you're going to teach it, and then also how you will measure the learning. So very specifically, the goals for this session are that by the end of today, you will be able to identify parts of a lesson plan. You'll know what questions to ask or what to think about when you're planning each phase of the lesson. And then you also will have some techniques for how to assess your students' learning. So those are my 3 goals for you today. Before we get too far into this session and you start taking a ton of notes, I am going to share this lesson planning guide with you in chat. It's going to take me just a moment to put it in here for you. Because my computer likes to be a little extra slow when I'm running a Zoom. Here we go. The one we're going to give you is this lesson plan guide. You will be able to get this lesson plan guide in our Canvas as well, so you can download it. But I am hopefully sending this lesson plan guide PDF to you through the chat because we're going to refer to this a lot. And so instead of you taking so many notes, you can at least see what's on here and then decide what you want to do. So if you're creating your own workshop from scratch using a lesson plan, it's a really good way to ensure that the workshop you're creating, it's organized in a way that's going to support learners, that it's going to support learning. So for example, when I created today's lesson, I made sure to have SWABOTs. SWABOT, it stands for students will be able to. It's a word I actually hate, but it works so well. And we'll talk about it in more detail. Essentially, they're my learning goals, and they are my students will be able to identify the parts of a lesson plan. I've now set up the goal for what it is we need to accomplish today. I have ideas later on how I'm going to assess whether you are able to do that. So using some sort of a lesson plan template is it's super helpful in keeping you organized. I am going to be honest, I don't ever use the template. I know all of the pieces that are part of the template. So when I created this PowerPoint presentation that we're reviewing, I put the information into my PowerPoint. So my slides give you information to look at. I have some notes in them to remind me things I want to touch on, what activities I want to do, how am I going to check for learning, how am I going to end this session, what is the extra information I want to give you at the end. So while I don't write it on the lesson plan, if you were to take a look at this presentation, you would see all of the pieces and parts in there. When I was first developing training, having something that said, Kristen, don't forget you want this and this and this in your class, in your workshop, in your course was super helpful for me. If you choose to run any of our workshops in a box that we're creating, if you choose to run them in your library, you're going to get a PowerPoint presentation just like the one I'm going through. And they are created using these lesson plan concepts. So even with those, you don't have to create lesson plans. However, if you're ever creating a workshop, this is super helpful to get you started. Also, if you're running a presentation, whether it's one we've created or somebody else has created, thinking about all of these parts of a lesson plan really do help you focus on making whatever you're presenting your learning centered about your students. It's also important to note that whatever lesson plans you are creating, they're for you. So if you're creating workshops based on things that you've learned through the Labor and Literacy Library program, you don't need to submit them to us. The lesson plans are for you to use. You're not going to need to turn them in. Really, the guide helps you think through each phase of your lesson. And as I said, I don't write them on the lesson plan. I do them in PowerPoint. Some people write them out first, type them out. I also find that on that lesson plan guide, I don't work top to bottom. I start with my goals. What do I want my students to learn? Then I kind of go into, okay, how do they do it? What are the steps in creating things? Then I go up to my hook, or like, I don't do it in that exact order. And the materials section that shows up at the top, I find myself filling that in throughout my entire lesson based on what I need. So it's a guide for you to use simply to make planning a lesson so much easier. So what I want to do, just go through the parts of the lesson plan one by one so that we get to know them a little bit better. And we've already started. We started talking about the parts of the lesson plan and how we're using them. For a basic lesson plan, you always want to include your materials, your goals or objectives, which again, I refer to them as SWABOTs, which is students will be able to. And then your lesson plan should have a rationale. What is it that I want my students to learn? Why is this important? So it's the reason that you're teaching. I try to include a do now or a hook, something that's going to get you thinking about and interested in what it is you're learning. You add in your procedures, your activities for learning, put together some closure, and sometimes maybe you even want to add in some homework. For short workshops like this that aren't an extended course that I'm going to see you back over and over again, my homework isn't so much you need to do this and hand it in, but hey, now that you've learned this, here are other places you can go to get more information. So have we done any of these already? Have we gone through, and in this lesson that I've started, what have we looked at so far?
SWOBOT.
Yeah, we did our SWOBOT. We did our do now, and we did our rationale. So I asked you to consider what an instructor should include when lesson planning. That was my do now. I then gave you the big picture rationale. We're here to learn how to use lesson plans as guides. And then we went specifically into the very 3 specific goals that you are going to come away from this session with. So our do now, sorry, I'm like jumping ahead of myself. Our do now is what we tried to talk about for lesson planning. Our rationale, this is the specific rationale we talked about. And then our SWOBOTs, our goals. So I'm going to go back up to the top of the lesson plan guide. And the first box was for materials. Materials are anything you need to be sure that you have access to, that you can use when you're running your lesson. And there's a whole list on this slide. You might need printouts. You might need a form to be filled out. Maybe you want a sign-in sheet to keep track of everybody who's coming in. Let's say that instead of me running this lesson plan workshop with you over Zoom, let's say I was going to do it in one of the meeting rooms in my library. Okay, so instead of us sitting computer to computer, I have a group of students in the library. I still have my PowerPoint, so I still need to make sure that I've got that going. What are some things I might need to consider or might need to be sure that I have? And Sarah's good at this one too, because she's forever keeping track of us and getting us organized.
Well, you've got to think about the format you want people sitting, and can they see a screen, and is there a screen?
Yep.
And is there a laptop in there?
Yep.
And is your presentation loaded on it?
Yep. Any other ideas, Lori?
Just making sure the equipment in the room works.
Yep. Absolutely.
From experience.
Yes. And, you know, even sometimes I test it the day before and I still run into trouble. But those are things that happen. And so you're going to have flexibility with those. But you both have like all of those ideas of the computer, the projector, not only thinking about how I want the classroom set up, but did I book the conference room? Did I fill out the correct forms so that the room is going to get set up the way I want? If this was the lesson, this is our lesson planning workshop, maybe I want handouts of the lesson plan as opposed to me sharing it over chat. Maybe bring some pens. I am horrible with people's names. I love that Zoom is showing me everybody's name right next to them because it's one of those things I struggle with. So maybe I want people to wear name tags. So anything that you might possibly want. And you're going to put that in the materials section. And I mentioned earlier, when I am actually running or creating a lesson plan, it takes me the entire time to fill in the materials because I don't know in the beginning of the lesson all of the things I'm going to need. So I'm forever going back to that section and adding in more information. And so here in PowerPoint, what happens is I just put it on my very first slide. If I were to show you the first slide of this presentation, it lists all of the things that I need to remember and make sure that I have. And honestly, sometimes I also have my first couple words I want to say. All right, just say, welcome to such and such, because for me, starting a class is the most nerve-wracking part of it. So anything that's going to help make sure that I can successfully run this lesson, I have set up in that material section. So we looked at our materials. The next thing that came after our materials was our SWOBOTs. And the SWOBOTs are your learning goals. And your learning goals should be very specific for your lesson. The first question you're going to think about is, what do I want my learners to be able to do as a result of this session? So what I had said was, when you leave here today, I want you to be able to think about the topic that you're teaching, and I want you to be able to create a lesson plan that's going to lead your students through what you've outlined for them. Your lesson plan goals, or your SWOBOTs, still should be measurable. So I'm not going to say, hey, I want you all to know about lesson plans. I can't measure how well you know about lesson plans. So when you want your goals to be measurable, you'll say things like, I want my students to be able to identify the parts of the lesson plan. I want them to be able to name all of the parts of a lesson plan. If I was being completely honest with you right now, it would be fabulous if the goal for today's session would be that each student in the workshop would create a lesson plan. Creating a lesson plan, maybe then being able to teach the lesson, get feedback, revise the lesson. That would be a fabulous goal. We just don't have the time. So you always want to think about how you're going to measure it. And then also realistically, how much can you accomplish? So given our time constraints, our goal was to identify the parts of a lesson plan, to know the questions or the considerations for each part of the lesson plan, and then to use techniques to assess student learning after each phase and after the lesson. That's about as deep as we're going to be able to get today. And this last one is super important. Your goal should never be understand. Students will understand the parts of a lesson plan. I mean, why do you not want to say understand?
Because understand may mean one thing to me and another thing to you.
I mean, it's so vague. It's so hard to measure. I could say, hey, Lori, do you understand? Uh-huh. Who knows whether you do or not? I mean, I sometimes sit in workshops, I'm like, oh yeah. And I mean, I actually do nod when I'm paying attention, but sometimes people, that's just how they sit. So you want to be very specific. I'm going to ask you to define the parts of a lesson plan. I can measure that. I can listen to your definition, and then I can know, yep, they've got it, or nope, I need to go back and reteach this a little bit differently. So first part of our lesson plan was our materials. The second part is our SWOBOTs. Let's take a look at some examples. So this first goal we wrote was, students will know how digital files are measured. So this is not a great goal, because what are they going to know? How are they measured? Well, I think files are measured because when they're in the computer measures them. So it's not specific enough. So an example of a better goal would be, students will be able to compare and calculate digital file sizes using the measurements, and then it explains them. Well, now I can look at that and say, hey, Sarah, how do you do blah, blah, blah? And she can use megabytes or kilobytes and explain it to me. So that's how they know what they're going to learn about, and how I know I'm going to be able to measure it. Students will understand digital file management, or in other words, how to organize files. Do you want to try to come up with? You don't have to if that one's not a good one for you. So for students to be able to understand how to organize files, I maybe want to say students will learn how to create folders and move files. Students will be able to show how they would organize digital files with clarity, with ease of reference. You know, oh, I've got all of these subfolders, etc. Students will understand the features of PowerPoint. Oh my, how vague is that one? I mean, I could spend a week teaching you PowerPoint. I could spend 15 minutes just showing you how to create a presentation. So in reality, you want to be specific. And even with this goal, my goal is that you're going to demonstrate what you've learned in PowerPoint by creating a PowerPoint deck. But it might be students will be able to insert slides with multiple formats, change fonts, change colors, and add animation. So I could be that specific with it so that my students know specifically what they're coming away with, and I know how to assess it. I find that the more specific your goals are, the better it is for your students, because they will then know, oh, this is what I'm learning today. I thought I was going to come in and I was going to learn how to create an Excel chart and insert it in my PowerPoint, but that's not in here. And they may even say, that's what I thought I was going to learn. You know what? We can talk about that after class. So you can find ways with those goals to assess what your students' expectations are, and then level set where you're really gonna go. Before I move into my hook and do now. So questions on the materials or setting goals. I'm curious, do you have a workshop in mind that you're going to create, or this is big picture just to get you started?
We're in the middle of reassessing all of our tech training classes. So we think this is a good starting point just to refresh and reset. So that's what we're using this for.
Great. Hopefully, yeah. So to know what you should be looking at, and oh, these classes are pretty good. They do have all of this, or oh, we need to work. Yeah. Okay, great. Standards and rationale. So the next section of the lesson plan, it's a really small line, and usually standards are set up on a lesson plan for K-12 teachers. Excuse me, standards are the state requirements for what a student is expected to learn in each grade level. So a lot of lesson plan templates that you find have a section that outlines the standards that are going to be covered. And while within this program, we don't have specific standards we're required to cover, I think it's really important to have a statement of why you're teaching what you're teaching. So why is it important for me to teach this lesson? Why is it important for my students to learn it? When I'm designing a lesson plan, when I'm creating and when I'm teaching a lesson plan, I like to have my rationale and then my SWABOTs posted somewhere. Maybe while I'm working on them, I've got it posted on my bulletin board so I can always go back and make sure what I'm teaching gets to those specific lesson goals, specific rationale. And then for my class, when I'm teaching it, oh, it's great to have what your goals are posted on the board so you can always point to where we're at on that. So the rationale, again, is not something specific that you have to put in there, but always think about, why is it, my mouse stopped working, why is it that this lesson is so important? What about it is going to be helpful for my learners? And at this point, we have really simply talked about how to get ready for teaching, and then why we're teaching what we're teaching. We haven't actually even dived into how we're going to teach it. So that's what the rest of this lesson plan goes through. And it seems sort of like, oh my gosh, I have to spend that much time at the beginning. But yeah, you do, because your workshop needs to be focused. You want to focus on these specific skills, even though there's 72 other things I would love to teach you. I would love to tell you about, but we don't have the time. We're going to focus on these particular items. And then, we'll have a side chat later on the 71 other things that we're going to go over. So we talked about this a little bit as well. Remember the do now at the beginning of the workshop where I asked you to consider what are some of the things to think about for planning a successful lesson. And I bet that your list would be longer now, but that's how we started off the lesson. So even though you enrolled in today's workshop because you were interested in how do you create a lesson plan, so you know why you're coming in, it still helps put you more into that learning mindset. So a good hook is always something that draws you into what you're learning and also helps you figure out why it's important to you. Do nows are a way of getting your learners thinking by specifically digging into the topic on their own. So sometimes I'll start a workshop with just a hook where I'm not going to say, oh, sit down and try to figure this out. I at one point had to teach a workshop on the new payroll system that we were using at my last company. My hook there was, hey, y'all, you got to learn this because if you don't learn how to do this right, you're not going to get paid. There you go. Everybody's hooked. With lesson planning, it's not such a quick, oh, yeah, I have to know this, but let's think about what we might need to start to think about for a lesson plan. And then it gets your juices flowing so that you get further into that topic. So you always want to start off the whole lesson with a hook. You might also decide that for each of the goals, you need to hook people a little bit more into each goal. So finding different ways to engage your learners, to give them a little bit of work to do on their own, to keep their brains going deeper and deeper into that topic are great ways and great things to include into your lesson plan. So we're going to try it. I'm going to ask you to take a look at one of the topics and I'll have you both do it for me, okay? And you're going to think of an idea for a hook or a do now. Just pick one of those. So whether you want to do internet safety or social media, or you want to come up with a hook or a do now for baking cookies, or even if you've got a different one, just come up with some way to get your lesson started. So for example, I'm going to pick creating an email address. So let's say that I've got a bunch of students who are coming to my workshop to create an email address. And I figure if you're coming in to learn how to create an email address, you probably don't have one. So what I would do is I would create a little slideshow with pictures of websites, pictures of advertisements, government programs, any of those that ask you to enter your email to get more information or to sign up to be able to use that program. That way, so look at all of these places you need email. Then I would ask the class if they've ever had an experience where not having an email was a negative impact, like that they couldn't accomplish something because they didn't have an email. So that to me is a great way to hook people, be like, you really do need an email address at this point in time. Do either of you want to share an idea?
Sorry, share an idea about why you need an email?
No. You're going to come up with, take one of these topics and come up with a hook, some way to start engaging. How would you start your workshop with a hook or a do now for any of these ideas?
Well, let's take being safe on the internet. We might want to start off with, just a banner or something you would see when you've been hacked, right? So that would scare the heck out of you, right? And call this number and you can get your computer back, that kind of thing. So I think that might be a good hook there.
I've had that happen, by the way.
Me too. It's not fun.
It's awful. Luckily, it was a work computer and I could call the help desk and be like, oh, you too, huh? Good thought, Sarah. Thank you. Other ideas? I'll do one more then. Baking cookies. The easiest way, I think, to hook somebody into learning how to bake cookies is to give them some cookies. So I might start out my session. I mean, unfortunately, it would not work over Zoom, but I might come in with a plate of chocolate chip cookies or whatever kind of cookies. Sorry, I suddenly started thinking about my mom's peanut butter cookies with chocolate frosting, and I got really distracted. But I would come in with cookies. All right, folks, aren't these amazing? You too can learn how to bake these cookies. So anything that is a little bit creative that will help get your students wanting to do it or understanding why it's so important. Does this make sense? Does this feel like it's going to be a great way to get people engaged into? I find these at first to be the most stressful things to create because, oh, it has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to just get people thinking, get them engaged in what you're talking about. So once they're hooked, we're actually going to teach. And the teaching part is your procedures and your activities. And this is really going to be probably the biggest part of your lesson plan. This is where all of the teaching happens. This is where all of the learning happens. You frequently want to have your lesson plan at your fingertips because you're going to be looking through it. But also you want to make sure that it's adaptable. You know, if something comes up in class that isn't part of your plan, but maybe is a good teachable moment, you could go for it. Or if while you're assessing, you find that not everybody is understanding, or maybe somebody said, you know, could you just step back for a minute? I didn't quite get what you were talking about. So you want to be able to go back and review. So you're going to have a plan, but you want to be adaptable, but you don't want to stray too far off your plan because you did set your goals at the beginning and you need to meet those goals by the end. So a lesson plan is just that. It's a plan, but there's got to be some flexibility in it. If you've attended already the cycle of instruction workshop, the cycle of instruction has to do with priming or hooking or engaging your students, explaining to them what it is that you want them to know. And then from there, you're going to model how to do those steps. Collaborate is a way to practice as a group the steps or the skills that you've taught. You then would assess your learners. And then from there, you can decide, do I need to course correct? Do I need to go backwards and review something, or can I move on to the next item that I'm teaching? And so that's why you're going to see the titles for the cycle, or I'm sorry, the titles for the parts of the cycle are listed in that section for procedures and activities. So unfortunately, I can't really teach you or tell you exactly what you're going to put in your procedures and activities because I don't know what you're teaching. But here are some great things I want you to consider while you're doing it. So for each activity, for each skill, for each chunk of content, you want to think about how much time is it going to take? Sadly, we don't have unlimited amount of time to teach. So as much as some of us might like that, our time is limited with our students and our attendees, their attention span is limited. I mean, right now you might already be at the end of that attention span, and that's when I have to start engaging you again. So you want to consider when you're teaching something, how long will it take? Is it relevant? Just because it's interesting, just because it's fun, doesn't mean that it needs to be shared or that it's going to forward your students' learning. So just because I want to talk to you about my mom's peanut butter chocolate cookies isn't actually going to get you to learn how to create a lesson plan. So you want to think, is this really relevant? Will it get my students to the SWABATs? You also want to think about if the parts of your activity are actually getting your students ready to engage. Do they effectively and fully model what needs to be learned? Will your students be ready to move on at the end of what you are showing them, what you're modeling for them? You should also always think about, well, what else can I provide? What else can I give my students that's going to support their learning? You also want to think, well, but am I providing too much support? Is my lesson ever giving them a chance to try on their own or to fail on their own so that I can then see, have I taught them what they need to know? So you want to think about how much support is going to ensure that they've understood the topic, but then how else am I going to make sure? How else am I going to make sure that I'm not showing them just too much and they think, oh, I can't do this if Kristen's not talking over my shoulder about it. And then this last one is so important. How am I going to know what my students have learned? How am I going to know that learning has really and truly happened? Now, I haven't assessed you all on every part of the lesson plan that we've gone through, but we looked at that exercise for how to write good SWOBOTs. And I asked you to try to come up with some hooks or some do nows, so I'm asking questions. I am waiting for answers. I am finding different ways to engage you. So your procedures and your activities are not just, I need to teach somebody how to use file, save as, and then where to save a file. But I need to make sure that I've hooked them on why it's important, just focused on the relevant things, not telling the story about the time I wiped out my entire hard drive. I'm showing them the steps. Then I am going to ask them to try it, so you want to think through all of those different pieces and parts. And then again, how am I going to check? How am I going to check for understanding? So that leaves us to move on to closure, homework, and what's next. And when you're done with a workshop, you should always plan how you want to end up that lesson. And this is the one that by the time I hit this point, I always feel like, I'll figure it out on the fly. And you never do. So once you have taught everybody, you've assessed everybody, plan out your closure, plan out your homework, your what's next, so that you really can end the session on a strong note, showing your attendees how much they've learned. I have the closure, the homework, I have those sections grouped together here, even though they're separate on the lesson plan, because they really do flow one right into another. So for example, my closure, to close the lesson, I want to make sure every learner gets it. In all honesty, in a workshop, it's really hard to make sure every single person has gotten every single thing you've taught. A simple way is really review your SWOBOTs with them, review your learning goals with the group. Even just doing a review of, here's what I wanted you to learn. Remember when we tried X, Y, and Z? That's when we were learning how to do that. Just pointing them back to what you were teaching or asking the questions about it is a great way to remind your learners of what they've learned. And this works really well if you've been assessing, you've been course correcting throughout. Homework and what's next. I mentioned earlier, when I'm teaching a single workshop, leaving you with homework is not exactly realistic because unless somebody's checking my homework, I'm not doing it. Sometimes I'm not doing it anyway. But if I'm going to give you work to do, you would want me to check it, make sure you did it right. So for this kind of a workshop, giving you homework is not useful. However, making sure that you know where you can find more information about this topic, giving you ideas to practice on your own. So I'm not assigning homework, but hey, now that you've done this, here's what else you should do, is a really helpful idea for the learners. So let's take a look at that. How did we do with our goals? And there are a bunch of ways to evaluate goals. You could ask students to agree and disagree with each of these statements. Now, that's a self-evaluation, and frequently we just say yes, because a lot of times we're in a very long workshop and we just want to go home and get more coffee and, got that, understood completely. Or you could ask the group to answer a question. So for example, what is the first section in your lesson planning guide? And if one of you were to answer me, the first section in the lesson planning guide is?
Materials.
Yes, right there. You've now seen that you did start to learn the parts of you were able to identify the parts of a lesson plan. What's the section in the lesson plan where you outline specifically what you expect your students to learn?
SWOBOT.
Yes, students will be able to. And then, so I could continue to ask you those questions. And earlier, I think I said you want to be a little bit flexible. With a larger group, I would ask a lot more questions so that everybody would get a chance to answer. So I have a whole list of questions in my notes, but you're answering. So I know that you're getting what we've been talking about. So you want to always keep an eye on that flexibility. Another way I could have done this would be to give you each a worksheet and turn in a lesson plan. Again, we're not coming back together. If you're writing a lesson plan and you want me to take a look at it, I'd be more than happy to, but I am not assigning that as homework for you. Your closure or your review to assess what was learned, it can take on so many forms, and it's going to depend on the time available. It's also going to depend on how crucial that it is that I ensure learning took place. If I was your driving instructor, I would not just ask you 3 questions and be like, yep, Sarah's a great driver. So driving safely is crucial. There would be a lot more assessment that I'm doing to ensure that I'm getting you where you need to go. So I know I didn't go through each of these specific parts, but you want to make sure that you, as an instructor, feel able to do all of these. So I want you to real quick read them. Is there anything in this list that you feel like we didn't cover enough, or I just have one more quick question about? Or do you feel like, hey, I'm going to be able to write a lesson plan? Or at least if you're here to understand what's in a lesson plan, I'm going to be able to review the courses that we currently give and decide if they actually do drive good learning. I see some nodding, so we're feeling pretty good. Wonderful. Our next steps then are that if you're watching this video, we just need to know that you did watch this recording, because that way you will let us know, you'll get your badge, you'll get credit for the class. Next steps for anybody at all are to consider attending the Cycle of Instruction course. The Cycle of Instruction workshop really focuses in more detail on that planning your activities for learning. And it's this great cycle that helps you understand how people learn and therefore how you should be teaching. So I think that's a really useful one. And think about if you want to use one of the workshops in a box that are available through the Labor and Literacy Library program. And again, if you don't know what the workshop in a box is, it is a pre-created workshop where we give you the lesson plans, the speaking points, etc. You take all of those materials and then you get up in front of your library patrons and you run that workshop for them. There is going to be a recording of each workshop so that you can look at it as a facilitator and see what it looks like, and then you'll be able to be the facilitator and run that workshop. So definitely something else to think about. And whoops, I didn't click the right place. Thank you so much. I am going to stick around if you have any other questions, anything else you want to talk about. But that was our lesson planning workshop.